Okay, I have the great honour, and it is a great honour to be the chairperson of TASC, who is hosting this event, as you know, and you're all very, very welcome. It's a very, very good turnout. I'm very pleased to see it. It's really good that we have very few empty seats. Typical trade union style, the empty seats are up the top. Everybody wants to be in the back benches. I don't know what it is about us, but I tell you, it's something that I share myself if I wasn't asked to do it, to do the honours such as I'm doing. I think we all, you know, this expression, if you couldn't keep your head not around or losing theirs, you obviously don't appreciate the gravity of the situation. But I think we are facing a very, very grave challenge arising from the very surprising, I would have thought, and I'll leave that to the panel to elucidate on, decision on foot of a Danish government appeal with regard to the Minimum Wage Directive and its implications for industrial relations generally. And I think that is something that kind of shakes our confidence to some degree. I mean, we all have an element of optimism about it, and we all think in terms of that things may or may not go fast or slow, but that they usually go forward. And so time it is when you see the real prospect of going way backwards is very unsettling, to say the least. So I'm sure that the quality of the panel that have agreed to talk today will ensure that we come with, or we will leave here rather, with a great enhanced insight, hopefully enhanced optimism, but if it is, I think it will be based on reality, because one thing we can guarantee is the contributions will be soundly based and so on. We have a very good panel to lead the discussion and to give our individual kick-off remarks, and just I'm not sure if I'm in the order of speakers or in the order of my memory. Firstly, we have Owen Reidy, who literally needs no introduction as General Secretary of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. Delighted to have you. We have Roland, who is the Professor of European Integration and Employment Relations in UCD, the School of Business in University College Dublin. We have Sherlock. Is Marie here yet? She's running late, but she will be here. Does that mean I can say nasty things about her before she arrives? No, I've nothing nasty to say about Marie. She's actually a friend of mine, and we're very delighted that she can be here. And finally, we have Conway-Walsh, who is also a Chapter Dála from Sinn Féin. And I don't see one. There you are, yes. So, can I just say a brief couple of focal, if I may, about TASC. I think all of you know that TASC is an independent think tank, and we value our independence very, very strongly. But independence isn't easy. We were very fortunate for many years of our existence. We're in existence almost 25 years now, which seems like an eternity ago, since Michael D. Higgins very generously hosted a reception to mark our 20th anniversary, and that was about 2 or 3 years late because of COVID. So I think we're in our 24th year now. But apart from a golden period when we were generously funded by Atlantic Philanthropies, Chuck Feeney's outfit very generously and almost with no strings attached, we really are an organisation who depends for our existence on the kindness of friends. And so I hope that some of you have, I hope all of you would self-describe as a friend of TASC, and for those of you who have the means to be able to put that into some sort of supportive contribution, that'd be really well appreciated, or indeed if you know anybody who might. I'm not legally bound to make that little appeal at the beginning of every TASC session, but I do think I'd be breaking a very, very strong unwritten rule if I didn't remind you that we do need your support. Anyway, I promise that's all I've got to say. Obviously just to introduce Oisín Gilmore, who is the author of the excellent report. I read it last night, and it's fantastic when you read a report and you feel more educated and more informed at the end of it. Sometimes you read a report and you feel more confused at the end of it. It's a great document, and I know it is a great foundation for the discussion we'll have today. introduce the panel. I'm glad Marie has joined us. I hope you managed to get your breath back, and I know you're rushing to be here in time for Arena Margaret. I hope you will contribute to the discussion either by way of asking questions or making contributions or sharing your own insights into the thing. But the good news is you won't need to hear from me afterwards unless you choose to stand beside me while we're having a cup of coffee. But otherwise I'll leave you alone. And Oisín, I'll hand over to you. Gurvila Malgard for the spot.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Mike, and thanks to you all for coming. And thanks in particular to the Irish Council of Trade Unions, the ICTU, and the National Services Union for commissioning this piece of research. So the reason for that this report is because of the opinion that was given by the Advocate General of the European Court of Justice, which recommended the annulment of the EU Directive on adequate minimum wages. This was felt that this was a major threat to progress on social Europe agenda. So I was asked to write this report connecting this directive with the question of social Europe agenda, and also examining the directive and the opinion of the Advocate General. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the importance of social Europe, giving a little bit of a history of it. Then I'll talk a bit about what is actually in the Adequate Minimum Wages Directive. Talk a bit about the impact of the directive so far. Then I'll examine the case, the arguments in the case, and the opinion given by the Advocate General. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the risks posed by this. So to start off with the importance of social Europe. I'll start off with a question. So very often European integration is seen as just simply a matter of trade deals, trade agreements. It's quite simple, but a question that kind of immediately emerges then is, if this is just simply a matter of trade, why does it come with this such a large institutional architecture? If we think of, say, the European Coal and Steel Community, which kind of got the ball rolling in 1951, this appears to have simply been a trade agreement between 6 states, but it created the High Authority, the precursor of the European Commission, the Common Assembly, the precursor of the European Parliament, the Council of Ministers, which still exists, and the Court of Justice, which of course we're here to talk about today. So the reason why this big institution was created was because it was understood after World War II that trade agreements are never simply trade agreements. They have big political implications, big social implications. There's winners and losers, and the negotiation and navigation of those issues needs to be something that is engaged in politically and has democratic oversight. After World War I, there was an attempt to reintroduce, before World War I you had a first age of globalization, an explosion in international trade. After World War I, there was an attempt to reintroduce the trade system that existed before World War I, which was based on the gold standard. That was by all accounts a massive failure. So while you saw a big increase in trade on an annual basis, a 3% increase in exports in the European states and the European Union, in the interwar period, the amount of trade, the amount of exports declined. Then, after World War II, there was an idea, okay, well, if we want to restore trade to facilitate economic growth, we need to do this in a way that is conscious of the need for democratic engagement and taking account of wider social questions. So because of that, there was what's sometimes called a cultural compromise, or sometimes called embedded liberalism. That's this idea that you need to embed trade liberalisation within national democratic systems with supranational oversight and policies that ensure living standards, rising living standards for all. And this was a major success. You saw really, really big increases in trade in the years following World War II. On an annualized basis, 8%. So this is a really big boom in trade. And if you look at the agreements that start the process of European integration, so the Treaty of Paris, which set up the European Coal and Steel Community, We see references to the possibility of re-employment of workers set at liberty by the evolution of the market or by technical transformations, or the appraisal of the possibility of improving the living and working conditions of the labour force and of the risks which meant such living conditions. This might seem like normal to us, but you don't find references like this in trade agreements in the 19th and early 20th century. This was something very new, a decision to try and incorporate these social questions right in at the very start of the European economic integration process. And if you look at the, to be clear what these treaties did, the Treaty of Paris, which established the European Common Steel Community, and the Treaty of Rome, which established the European Economic Community, what they aimed to do was to protect the ability of national governments to intervene in the economy to ensure good living standards. It didn't set out to establish a centralised European mechanism for social policy, but it is right at the start of the European economic integration process. This question of social Europe is there. By the late 1960s, this post-war way of managing post-war economic international economic arrangements was under pressure. And a response to that is that you start to get people advocating increased European integration, especially to move towards much stronger European integration and direct European regulation of various aspects of the market. And with this you see the rise of what we now think of as social Europe, where you have direct European interventions to improve working and living conditions across Europe. So here you can see Social Europe 1.0. Most famously, of course, is the Equal Pay Directive and the Equal Treatment Directive. There's a number of other directives relating to workers' protection during business restructuring. In the subsequent decade or so, not a huge amount happens. The European integration project slows down a bit. With the Single European Act in 86-87, with Maastricht in 92, you see a revival of European integration as an issue. And here again, you see the revival of social Europe as an issue. And here, kind of the big beast is the Working Time Directive in terms of social Europe. There's a whole range of other directives that are introduced. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I list some of them there. But one thing I would point out is that you look at the dates of them, and they're nearly all early 90s. From the mid-90s onwards, you don't see a huge amount of progress on social Europe. In fact, for 20 years, really, you see very little progress on the social Europe agenda. And some of this is encapsulated or summarised in this annual report that's produced by the European Commission, Labour Market Developments in Europe. If you look at the 1912 issue, and they have an appendix which gives an overview of a decade of labour market reforms in the EU. And they are what they refer to as employment-friendly reforms. And these are reforms that push very much directly against the social Europe agenda. They talk positively about reducing the progressivity of income tax. So that means people on low incomes pay relatively more than people on higher incomes. They talk positively about decreasing unemployment and social benefits, positively about weakening employment protection laws, positively about lowering the minimum wage, positively about reducing the collective bargaining power of trade unions, and positively about increasing working hours while promoting part-time contracts. So this is a policy agenda that pushes very directly against the social Europe agenda that gets talked about. And of course in Ireland we saw this very directly as well with the bailout programme. Just to point out here, these are literally screen grabs of what's in the programme. This advocated labour market reforms involving the downward adjustment of the minimum wage, advocating against union negotiated sectoral wage agreements, advocated for reducing income protection for unemployed workers, and advocated for more stringent job search conditionality on unemployment benefits. So once again, these are policies that go against workers' working and living conditions in Ireland, but also more broadly in Europe. One thing I'll point out here is just, again, this is from the bailout programme, very explicitly advocated or really compelled the Irish government to reduce the minimum wage by €1. And this was a failed policy agenda. There's 20 years of policy coming from Europe pushing against workers' working and living conditions. It failed socially, it exacerbated inequality, increased in-work poverty, increased social precariousness, it failed economically, it created massive imbalances within the EU. We saw this with the euro crisis, it weakened growth prospects by presenting a growth model based on an orientation towards external demand rather than internal demand. And it failed politically by promoting an economic governance model that's not accountable to European citizens, fueling Euroscepticism, delegitimizing the EU, and promoting and contributing to the rise of a Eurosceptic far right. Now, there has, since then, there's kind of a growing awareness that these policies fail. And with the Juncker Commission in 2014 to 2019, you start to see this. Juncker says, I want Europe to have a social AAA because the social AAA is just as important as the economic and financial AAA. So it's a bit of a gimmicky way of saying it, but what he's talking about there is the AAA ratings that the rating agencies would give the government debt. He's saying, no, it's just as important to focus on these social questions. What came out of this was the European Pillar of Social Rights in Gothenburg in November 2017. The EPSR outlined 20 principles across 3 key areas. However, despite the title, there's actually no enforceable rights contained in the EPSR. There's just non-binding political principles. So some were concerned that this was simply, more hot air about the wonderful nature of social Europe without there being much meat to it. However, under the von der Leyen Commission, there have really been a number of initiatives that make this quite real. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but there's been a whole raft of directives and regulations and recommendations and guidelines to really push the social Europe agenda in the last number of years. So you can talk about this kind of social Europe agenda in the 1970s, where you have the Equal Pay Directive, social Europe agenda in the early 90s, where you have the Working Men Directive, and a bunch of other things, and you have a social Europe agenda today. And really, the key big beast in this is the EU Adequate Minimum Wages Directive. So what does the EU Adequate Minimum Wages Directive do? It's a directive that has one goal, which is to improve living and working conditions, and it tries to do that in 2 ways. One is to ensure minimum wage adequacy, that minimum wages are adequate, and the other is to promote collective bargaining coverage. In terms of ensuring minimum wage adequacy, essentially what it sets out to do is that it says it creates rules for the procedures around setting and updating statutory minimum wages. And it sets out a set of criteria that need to be considered when setting minimum wage. These include the purchasing power of the minimum wage, factoring cost of living, the general level of wages, the growth rate of wages, and the long-term national productivity levels and trends. In addition, member states must use indicative reference values. Now, to be clear here, member states are free to choose whatever indicative reference value they want, but the directive suggests 2 indicative reference values. One is 60% of the median wage, another is 50% of the mean wage, but these are not you don't have to use those indicative reference values, you really have to use an indicative reference value. The directive also has a number of other requirements around how regular the minimum wage is updated, rules around automatic indexation, a rule that you have to have a consultative body, so in Ireland that's the Low Pay Commission, rules that the minimum wage, any deduction or variation in the minimum wage has to be non-discriminatory and proportional. This is interesting in relation to Ireland, which I'll come back to later. It has to involve social partners, and these minimum wage laws have to be enforced. And the second mechanism is promoting collective bargaining coverage. So the reason why it says that collective bargaining coverage is being promoted is because the directive says collective bargaining is an important means to ensure that workers are protected by adequate minimum wages. Collective bargaining supports general wage developments, and it supports the living and working conditions of workers. There's 2 bits of promoting collective bargaining in the directive. One affects all member states, and so it says that with the aim of increasing collective bargaining coverage and to facilitate the exercise of the right to collective bargaining coverage. So now this is significant in that this is a piece of legislation that compels member states to increase collective bargaining coverage. That's an aim that will be set down in law. So not simply as quite different to the type of policies that are being advanced in 2012. It isn't simply like a policy. It's a piece of law that will require just promoting collective bargaining coverage and increasing collective bargaining coverage. And how that's supposed to be done is to strengthen the capacity of social partners, in particular at sectoral or cross-industry level. So this isn't simply a matter of encouraging union growth and having to negotiate at a shop level, but also to promote sectoral bargaining. It requires that member states ensure that social partners have access to appropriate information so that they can engage in wage bargaining, and it requires that member states take measures to protect both individual workers and individual trade union activists and the unions themselves and employers' organisations, and that the member states must take measures against any acts of interference that would interfere with the ability of people to engage in collective bargaining. So these are very strong new rights that will exist for trade unions, and very significant. The other way that the directive aims to promote collective bargaining is in situations where member states will have a collective bargaining coverage of less than 80%. So in Ireland it's about 34%, well below 80%. In member states such as Ireland, the member state is required to provide a framework for enabling conditions for collective bargaining, either by law or after consulting social partners or by agreement with them, and also to establish an action plan to promote collective bargaining. So again, these are big requirements. So what is the impact of the minimum of this directive so far? Well, if we look first at the mechanism of promoting minimum wage adequacy, we see that a very significant impact. There's been a remarkable surge in minimum wages all across the EU. So the directive was, the proposed directive was published in 2020. Between 2020 and 2025, we've seen a surge in minimum wages all across the EU. In Ireland, we hear all the time in Ireland from employers' organisations and so on, that the minimum wage is increasing way too fast, it's completely, what's happened in the last number of years, it's completely out of control. But actually, if you look at it in comparison with other European states, we're not, we're way not at the top end of it. In 6 European states, minimum wages have increased by over 70% over the last 5 years. In Ireland, they've increased by over 34%, which is a very big increase, but it's still not up at the top end. And this increase in minimum wages is happening all across the EU. Another way that you can see the impact of the directive is that Ireland isn't the only country that has taken up this target of 60% of the median wage by 2026. All across the EU, you've seen member states take up targets of 60% or 50% for variations on them. In the report, there's a table that details this. It'll take quite a while to go through it all, so I'll skip over that. In terms of the impact on collective bargaining, the first thing to point out is that there's a big difference in the levels of collective bargaining coverage across the EU. In some states, it's already over 8%, in some states it's below 20%. Ireland is towards the bottom end of it. Again, we have collective bargaining coverage of about 34%. So what would be required to increase up to 80% would be a big change. Just to talk specifically about the impact in Ireland, as I mentioned, there's 34% increase in the minimum wage over the last 5 years. There's a target of 60% of the median wage by 2026. The government has introduced the statutory instrument to align the Low Pay Commission with the requirements of the directive. Also worth mentioning, by the way, is the report on sub-minimum use rates in Ireland. If you are aged under 21, you have an entitlement to a lower minimum wage than if you're aged 21 or over. The Low Pay Commission report on sub-minimum use rates explicitly advocates the abolition of these rates on the basis that they are not compliant with the EU directive. That report was sent to government last summer. Government hasn't acted on it so far, so it would appear that we are not in compliance with the EU directive, but immediately you can see how some of the implications of this directive. In terms of the impact on collective bargaining, as I mentioned, going from 34 to 80% is a huge difference. We're well off that target. And what it would mean to make that transition would surely require a massive change in Ireland's industrial relations environment. One thing that you see has been the Labour Employer Economic Forum's high-level working group report on collective bargaining. The chair of that report, Michael Doherty, has said that that report although it came out in 2022 before the directive came into force, he said that it was produced very much in the shadow of this directive. The action plan from the government is due to be published this year. About 2 weeks ago, they had started the consultation for the action plan, so if anybody wants to make a submission, that's live at the moment. Another thing that Michael Doherty also pointed out is that he argues that there's been a legal paradigm shift by he's examined a number of court cases over the last 10 years in relation to trade union rights, and says that the decisions that the courts have been making in the last 5 years or so are very noticeably different to what they were 10 to 15 years ago. I'm going to skip over that just for the sake of time. So this is a big piece of legislation already having a big impact, potentially having a very large impact on the industrial relations environment all across the EU. So it's not surprising then that the EU Trade Union Confederation said that it's the most important piece of workers' legislation at the EU in a generation. However, it's at risk. Why is it at risk? Because in 2023, Denmark took a case to the European Court of Justice, arguing that the directive should be annulled. The basic reason that they say it should be annulled is because they say that the EU, the European Parliament and Council did not have the competence to legislate in this area. They didn't have the competence under the EU treaties. Now, before we get into what the Advocate General's opinion was, it's probably worth explaining what an Advocate General is, because they don't exist in Ireland's domestic court system. So obviously in Ireland's domestic court system, you have the two sides, present their evidence and argue over the case, then the judge makes a decision. In the European Court of Justice, there's kind of another step in between where the two sides make their arguments. Then there is an expert employed by the court to produce an expert independent opinion on the basis of the evidence, which they then present to the judge, or to the judges, and then the judges make a decision informed by this expert opinion. So that's what an Advocate General is. They produce this expert opinion that is independent expert, and generally what happens is that the courts go along with the opinion produced by the Advocate General. So the Advocate General in this case, in the 14th of January, he produced his opinion, and he basically supported Denmark's argument and recommended the full annulment of the Adequate Minimum Wages Directive. So to explain why, it's worth examining what is the legal basis of the Adequate Minimum Wages Directive. Okay, because this is what this case is over. So the legal basis of the Adequate Minimum Wages Directive is Article 153 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. So bear with me a bit, because the next bit is going to be quite kind of legalese, a little bit technical. Article 153 says that the EU has the competence to produce legislation in the area of working conditions, and specifically has competence to produce directives on this issue. So that would appear quite simple. The directive is about working conditions, so it should be legal. However, Article 1535 states that the provisions of this article shall not apply to pay. Okay, well, it's a directive about minimum wages, so clearly the Denmark is right. It doesn't, they don't have the competence. Well, the problem is that pay, of course, is a working condition. Now, I'm not saying that's my opinion, that pay should be considered a working condition. I'm saying in EU law, pay is a working condition. In the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, so it's the same treaty, Article 45 refers to remuneration and other conditions of work. So here clearly remuneration is a condition of work, it is a working condition, pay is a working condition. Also, there's a whole raft of pieces of EU legislation that explicitly list pay and remuneration under the title of a working condition. So in EU law, pay is a working condition. So how can it be that you can say the EU has the ability to legislate in the area of working conditions, which includes pay, but it doesn't include pay? So how the courts have interpreted this is that they've interpreted this article, this pay restriction, restrictively. Now, there's a whole raft of case law around this, but just they very often kind of repeat themselves, the phrasing is very similar throughout them. But what they say is that this pay exception must be interpreted only as covering elements such as the equivalence of all or some of the constituent parts of pay, or the level of pay, or the setting of an EU-wide minimum wage. But that it shouldn't be interpreted more broadly, because doing so would affect some of the other areas referred to in Article 137. That's Article 153, it just got remungered by the Lisbon Treaty. So what this means is that the courts have ruled that the pay exclusion only applies if the EU directly interferes with pay, such as by directly setting wage levels. Now, to be clear, the Adequate Minimum Wage Directive does not directly interfere with pay. It only sets a framework through which statutory minimum wages must be determined. It doesn't say what the minimum wage level should be. It doesn't say what it should be in relative terms. It doesn't do anything like that. It merely sets a framework through which deliberations over setting minimum wage, what's the framework through which the decision over the level of pay should be. It doesn't say what the level of pay should be itself. And this was because the people who drafted this legislation, were familiar with EU law, and they knew that that wouldn't be allowed. They were very conscious of it, so the directive was carefully designed to avoid breaching the Article 153 pay exclusion. So given this, how is it that Emilio, the Advocate General, argued that the Minimum Wage Directive should be annulled? First of all, it's a long opinion if you want to go and read it, but he acknowledges the case law, he's familiar with it. And he says, okay, there's all this case law that says the pay restriction needs to be interpreted restrictively and so on. But he says, actually, in this case, it doesn't apply. And the reason he says it doesn't apply is because he says previous pieces of legislation had an object other than pay, whereas the Adequate Minimum Wage Directive, its object is pay. So, for example, the Working Time Directive has provisions in it around paid annual leave. So it gives you a right to paid annual leave, so that's clearly a question of pay. But he said, but that's about leave, it's not about pay. Right? That's his argument. And so to go to restate again, he said the previous case law doesn't apply because those cases dealt with legislation where the object does not pay. The object of the Adequate Minimum Wage Directive is pay, and as such directly regulates pay. Therefore, it violates Article 1535, consequently the entire directive should be annulled. How does Emilio justify this? Why does he say that the object is pay, whereas in other directives it's not pay? This might sound slightly ridiculous because it is, but he says, well, it's in the name. The title of the directive is the Adequate Minimum Wage Directive. It has wages in the title, so clearly its object is wages. Now he further claims that in the directive itself, when it talks about the subject matter directive, that it says that the object is wages, but he's quite deceptive here, so which I'll try to come back to if I have time. Now there's a number of very large problems with Emilio's argument. The first one is that this distinction between the object of a directive and the provisions of the directive, the content of the directive, appears to be completely new. It appears to be an innovation by Emilio himself. So while he uses this distinction to disregard all existing case law on this article, he doesn't cite any case law to justify it, he doesn't cite any legal precedent to justify it. It does not appear to be a distinction that currently exists in law, but rather it's a distinction that Emilio wants to introduce into law. Second problem is that if you think about this distinction, it leads to preposterous implications. So if the problem with the Adequate Minimum Wage Directive is simply that it has wages in the title, we could keep the directive as it is, but just change the title, which is like a completely trivial change. And you might say, well, that's clearly not what he's getting at. But if we think of the Working Time Directive, as I said, it has provisions around paid annual leave. But suppose we took those provisions around paid annual leave and we extracted them from the Working Time Directive, put them into a new directive, and we call it the Paid Annual Leave Directive. Nothing legally would change, but for Emilio, this now would be illegal. This now would be outside what's covered by the treaties. And that seems preposterous, it seems rather ridiculous. But that is basically what his argument is. His baffling argument suggests that the directive's legality hinges not on its contents or its provisions, but rather on its title. A third problem, so there are kind of core problems with his argument, but there's other problems. So with his opinion in general that aren't kind of necessarily related to his core argument, but kind of illustrated. So just to go back to this question of, he claims that the another way that you can see the object of the directive is in because in Article 1, where it sets out the subject matter of the directive, it says, with a view to improving in particular the adequacy of minimum wages for workers. But actually that's not what the sentence says. He just cut out the bit where it says, with a view to improving living and working conditions in the Union, which is legal. So he cuts out the legal basis of the treaty to give a false impression that the object of the directive is something else, which is actively misleading. A further problem is that there's some really baffling bits of the opinion. Well, no, I won't get into that, but I will get into that in a second. So the fourth problem is that his argument seems to not simply be based on legal reasoning, but it seems to be ideologically motivated, based on a kind of right-wing understanding of the nature of the market and the importance of the market and wage competition. Now, it's completely fine to have a right-wing idea about the importance of wage competition, but if you have those type of politics, the way you advance them is through democratic politics. You don't, use your position in the courts to sabotage the democratic decisions of the European institutions. So he says that I cannot rule out that the pay exclusion also serves other purposes by preventing the harmonisation of wage levels applicable in each of the member states. The pay exclusion contributes to maintaining competition between undertakings operating in the internal market. Now, to be clear, in the EU treaties, there's a very explicit aim that an aim of European integration is the upward convergence of living and work conditions, but he's saying that the EU treaties were written for the exact opposite purpose, and the European Trade Union Confederation has really taken issue with this. So yeah, another kind of bizarre argument in the opinion is, Emilio writes that to my knowledge, the Adequate Minimum Wage Directive is the first legal instrument at an EU level in the field of minimum wages. Now this, of course, will come as a surprise to everyone in this room, because in Ireland, the EU legally compelled us to reduce our minimum wage by €1. I showed you the text earlier, it's not ambiguous, it's very clear. It was in the Féin program. So, what are the implications of this, if this goes ahead? Well, firstly, Emilio argues, okay, well, every other directive based on Article 153 is completely different to this directive. It's really hard to see the difference. And it is important that the Adequate Minimum Wages Directive is not the only EU directive based on Article 153. In fact, a number of very important pieces of EU legislation in relation to social Europe are based on the same article. The Pregnant Workers Directive from 92, the Working Time Directive 93, and the Revised Working Time Directive 2003, the Temporary Agency Work Directive in 2008, the Work-Life Balance Directive in 2019. These are all based on this article. And these are the directives that provide you with maternity leave entitlements, that provide you with paternity leave entitlements, that provide you with the right to a 40-hour week, the right to paid leave, paid maternity leave, paid maternity leave. So they all have elements of them that relate directly to pay. And there's a question here about, okay, well, if this, if this directive falls, what's the implication for all these other directives? It's not clear. It's not clear. Given how oddly weak Emilio's argument is, if the courts go along with it, it's very hard to believe that they are doing so purely on the basis of legal argumentation. It seems much clearer that they would be doing so on the basis of their political beliefs about the nature of the market in relation to the market and the European Union. Now, if the court annuls the directive, what it will be doing is it's saying that EU actions to reduce minimum wages are legal, EU actions to increase minimum wages are illegal. It's a very, very hard situation to explain. And if that does happen, the legitimacy of the EU as an institution that can be used to improve working and living conditions will be in tatters. Again, on the question of social Europe, Social Europe has been central to the European integration projects from the start, and its abandonment over a 20-year period was a disaster. It was a social disaster, an economic disaster, and a political disaster. Unless Social Europe and the project of improving working and living conditions for ordinary Europeans is put back on the agenda, and in fairness it has been put back on the agenda, but unless it stays on the agenda and this directive is fully implemented, the social basis for European economic integration will evaporate. Finally, I'd say, having said why it shouldn't be annulled, it's worth saying that if it is annulled, that doesn't change the social situation. There remains a large problem of in-work poverty, a large problem of low pay, and poor living and working conditions. Even if the adequate minimum wage directive is not fully implemented, these problems still need to be addressed. And improving the adequacy of minimum wages and promoting collective bargaining remain key mechanisms to achieve those goals. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Oisín, and not least, thank you very much for getting us back onto our correct time hopes. Thank you very much. I should have said in my opening remarks, of course, that we owe a special debt of gratitude to ICTU and the Financial Services Union for the financial support of this event. So that's really appreciated. I'd say other words of thanks when I come to the end. As you know, the gig was designed as a round table, apart from individual round tables, which I don't think is what the phrase implies. We have set it out in such a way, but as far as I'm concerned, and as far as you're concerned, I'll leave it to the speakers themselves after they've spoken about, or before they've spoken about it, what company and sit here. We will have a discussion, and we might at that stage invite even the shyest of them to come up and to join us. But I'm going to take as our first speaker, because I know that she has a particular time pressure, and I'm very grateful to Marie for excluding some of her other commitments in order to oblige us. But so our first respondent will be Marie Sherlock, and as most of you I think would know, Marie is the TD for Dublin Central since 2024, and prior to that she was a senator in Erne from 2020 up until that time. She was also a researcher for the Party of European Socialists in the European Parliament, and was a trade union official and economic advisor to ICTU, and she held that role for over 10 years. So very well. Thank you very much.
Might as well stand here. Okay, perfect. Well, look, thanks very much, Mike, and to Oisín, and thrilled to be here today. Delighted to be joined by my colleague, Labour Party spokesperson, Workers' Rights, Nessa Cosgrove as well, and indeed to see many friends from within the trade union movement, from Lucy Ennis and Francesca Ross and others here in the audience. Oisín, I think we owe you a debt of gratitude in terms of putting together that history of a social Europe into one document, because I think for many of us it's all in our heads and bits and pieces, but to be able to put it together and to give us that tour de force of I suppose where social Europe has grown out of, and the potential, and now the grim situation as I see it, is certainly really useful. I think particularly when you see how the negative impact of the Barroso Commission in the 2000s, and indeed the potential that the van der Leyen, the last or the first of the commission under Ursula von der Leyen has brought. Of course, we're not quite clear now where all that is going to go, but I suppose in terms of how groundbreaking the Adequate Minimum Wage Directive was, and indeed the Pay Transparency Directive as well, certainly it jars very much of our commentary about Ursula von der Leyen, but I think it is to be acknowledged in terms of that previous commission and how much it has has driven that agenda, and I suppose the uncertainty that we now find ourselves in. And I suppose when reflecting on where we are now, to my mind, there's a feeling that we're probably further behind now in Ireland than where we were maybe 5 years ago. Because when you look at where the political landscape here in this country and in Europe, an increasingly distracted European Union that is now having to fight off I suppose an existential crisis, both in terms of our borders and also in terms of our values. I think there are massive issues there in terms of the extent to which a social Europe will be driven by the current Commission, but also in terms of the government of the day in this country, and I suppose a rowing back of commitments that were made, and commitments that were never made wholeheartedly, but commitments nonetheless to a living wage. Now, I don't think any of us in the room ever believed that that the living wage, or of course the living income, as I prefer to talk about, because you can have a great hourly wage, but you have to have the hours as well. That was never going to be a viable proposal that was going to be delivered after the term of government under which the Taoiseach Varadkar led. But I suppose when we look at the rolling back of those commitments, and of course the trade war or the non-war that we're currently in at the moment, it certainly is a rather depressing landscape. I think one of the key issues for us in the Labour Party at the moment is obviously a party hugely committed to collective bargaining certainty, and I know Rose Conway-Walsh is going to speak later as well, so always important to acknowledge other office members, but I suppose ourselves in the Labour Party, and I know other parties have a huge commitment, of course, to trying to ensure that we have a real right to collectively bargain, to be recognised for collective bargaining purposes in this country. Obviously Ireland stands unique amongst most other EU member states in not having that right. But in terms of our path or our route to getting to there, obviously the view had been that the directive was going to deliver on this, but it also requires a government of the day as well to not just put an action plan in place, but to actually truly deliver on that real right to be recognised for collective bargaining purposes. And I suppose the big issue, the issue in our country for many years is that many governments of the day have looked the other way, both in terms of the weak legal penalties that face employers engaged in egregious behaviours against their workers, if they're not paying their workers properly or unfairly dismissing their workers. We see how government departments themselves are showing an appalling example in ignoring Labour Court recommendations. And of course we see it in terms of how the government of the state spends its near 20 billion euros state procurement budget in failing to see how that money is ever spent in lifting the wages and conditions of the workers providing those services. And I suppose that to us are the missed opportunities, and certainly something that I think as a union movement, as a political movement, we need to focus to a much greater extent now. Because while we of course will await the outcome of the advisory, well obviously we have the advisory opinion, but of the court, and I think, Oisín uses the word preposterous, and it is outrageous, the arguments that have been employed, but we don't know what the outcome is going to be. But I suppose nonetheless we can't sit and wait here in this country for that. What we need to do is ensure that our legislative response to paving the way for a right to be recognised for collective bargaining purposes has to be put in place. And I suppose from our perspective, we have to start with that, I suppose, unfair dismissals space. We produced legislation last year which sought to overhaul how unfair dismissals is dealt with in this country. Because ultimately, if employers can act with impunity with regards to treating workers badly, then workers don't stand a chance, however, hoping to organise and unionise within their workplaces. And I think that is the starting point for me if we're being practical about how we improve working conditions in this country. And I know that there's a fantastic, really strong union campaign, Respect to Work campaign, led by member unions within the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, who've been very much putting forward that message. And to my mind now, we have to be very practical about how we actually help workers in this country. So ensuring that we have a level playing field across the health and safety legislation, unfair dismissals and the Payment to Wage Act, in terms of that egregious behaviour that bad employers are effectively targeted and tackled, and using that as to pave the way to ensure that workers that employers no longer can act with impunity in this country when they treat workers badly. That is still a long way away though from, I suppose, the nirvana, as we would all like it, that unions can effectively access workplaces, that workers can access unions within their workplaces. But we have to start in that place. And I suppose as a Labour Party, that will be very much our focus over the coming period, to ensure that we get that legislative framework right, and to support the union movement in its efforts to ensure that we ensure that every worker can freely organise in this country. But I suppose crucially to say, to thank Oisín for his work on this. Obviously there's a huge degree of nervousness about the political landscape at the moment at EU level and of course domestically, but I think by pursuing those practical steps as I see it, we can begin to try and make progress against what is a government now that has set its face against any sort of progress, and the reality is, with regards to sick pay or of course the national minimum wages, that it is those lowest paid, those people who have, those workers who literally are living from week to week are the worst affected. But of course this is a government out of touch with many of those workers, so we need to push back in terms of our agenda to ensure that at least at the very minimum those bad employers out there cannot continue to act with impunity. So to thank Oisín for his work, to thank Mike for the invitation today, and TASC of course for all the excellent work as usual. I'm very sorry that I have to run at 2 o'clock when Leaders' Questions is on and have to be present for that, but thank you for the invite here, and happy to support the work in future.
Thank you very much, Marie. And as Marie herself said, we had to reschedule the order that we had anticipated, but we're very pleased that you guys do. And I've checked with those kind of words. Would you prefer to go now? Are you under the same time pressure?
I really am, yeah.
Yeah,
so
okay. Well, yeah, I think that's absolutely fine.
I'll be short.
That's absolutely fine. So I'm very, very happy to welcome Rose Conway-Walsh, who is the TD, as I suppose everybody knows, in Mayo. For Mayo, I should say, since 2020. Before that, she was a senator from 2016 to 2020, and before entering politics, she worked in community development. So Rose, you're very, very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks, Oisín, and some of my colleagues are here as well. And thanks for all the work you've done on this, Oisín. I think it's really important for us, and I know Maria will agree to have it broken down in the way that you have in the report. It's really important that we're all on the same page, and it's really good to see Owen here, obviously, as well, who is so active in that space. I'm also Sinn Féin's spokesperson on enterprise, tourism and employment, and now I've been given the job of chairing the Committee on National Security and Defence as well. But why I say around the enterprise section, I am really fearful of what's happening right here, right now, across the board. Not just this directive in terms of the direction it's going in, but I can very, very clearly see how this space is being used for the erosion of workers' rights and to roll back on everything that has been done heretofore. And that is why it's so important that we're all on the same page, facing in the same direction on this directive and how it's going to be implemented. Obviously, we have the space between now and June, so there are a number of things that we can do. I mean, I'm very much in the space that if we, if we want a well-functioning economy, we have to have the harmonious relationships between businesses and employees. It's a win-win situation, and I know, Owen, I've often heard you say that yourself. So this isn't against business, it's about what we create for the future. But if we go in the direction that governments seem to be going at the moment in terms of auto-enrolment, in terms of the minimum wage, and the living wage, sick pay, and all of those things, we are really going to end up in a very, very precarious situation. So I really see this as being extremely dangerous in terms of shaping the future to where we're at. This legislation is obviously good legislation, and it will not only benefit workers but obviously the wider economy. And if we roll back on this, I think we will regret it for generations to come. So all of the parties of the left have a role to play, both in the Oireachtas and in the European Parliament, in getting this through. Obviously, as a party, Sinn Féin has voted for the directive when it went through the European Council in 2022, and the left group that we are members of strongly condemn the advocate Jennings' opinion. And obviously we have to see what is going to be the outcome of that in June, but I very much agree with Oisín. I think legally the case is very strong. I mean, how can you say that you ignore case law? You know, it's just so unprecedented in the way that this is being tackled. But there is that ideology there that in order to be competitive and in order to succeed and in order to have economic growth, that somehow you must diminish workers' rights. So what will happen now is obviously Maria, you're on the Enterprise Committee, the Oireachtas Enterprise Committee as well. Your health, right? I wish you were on the Enterprise Committee as well. But we will work on that committee. So I see that the committee already has noted the Advocate General's opinion and stated that it will still work on the action plan to transpose the directive. Now, I will bring it to the Enterprise Committee with my colleagues for discussion to ensure that it's transposed on that. So I think there's a number of practical things that we can do between now and June. I just make the overall point of, workers have never worked so hard and yet struggled so much. And we must be cognizant of that as we speak on this. So I don't want to go on about it because I think you have outlined it very well, Oisín, in terms of what the threats are that are there. But it really will take collective action for us to push the government and to push back on the agenda that is currently there, that somehow you must erode workers' rights in order to be able to thrive and survive. And it's putting business and small and medium businesses who are struggling themselves at the moment as well against workers. So we just can't let that happen. So that's all I'd say to you today. And I'm really sorry that I'm Russian, so I won't, like Maria, I won't be able to stay until the end. Okay.
Thank you very much, Rose, and indeed thanks to both of you. And I think any sane trade unionist realises that the trade union movement on its own can't achieve the research change. We do rely on our friends in the Oireachtas to support and indeed at European Parliament levels. That's very, very much appreciated. I do realise that one of the implications of having guest speakers from Dáil Éireann is that they come from a very, very busy place and they have to get back to a very busy place. But anyway, I'm very grateful. So we're returning to our original our next speaker then is going to be Professor Roland Erne. Roland is Professor of European Integration and Employment Relations in the UCD School of Business. For the past number of years, he's been Principal Investigator of the European Research Council project, Labour Politics and the EU's New Economic Governance Regime, brackets, European Union, end quote. These things with their big titles really are challenging, and it just gives an impression of the depth of academic endeavour and research that goes into producing these things. He did that in the context of the UCD here, the Institute for Public Policy. And that project resulted in the book, Politicising Commodification, European Governance and Labour Politics from the Financial Crisis to the Current American Emergency, and that was in 2024. So that's certainly an impressive CV, and I'm sure you're looking forward, as I am, to hearing Roland's contribution to Caroline.
Thank you very much. I prepared some little slides to support my arguments, but before we see the slides, a very big thank you for TASC for organizing this. I've been working and living in Ireland for more than 20 years and became Irish citizen just in December of last year. And I'm very happy to be invited back. And as Mike said, I did have the privilege to study labor politics after financial crisis until the COVID emergency for 6 years. A very big European project. We got €2 million and we could really go into the depth and produce the book, which you can download for free, and which I have also some copies over there as well. And when I finished after this task, I thought, oof, now I can relax a bit. Everybody of our team got good positions. But then just in January, the Advocate General's opinion came out and made statements that were actually, as you have already heard from Oisín, contradicting the facts in the field. So I felt triggered to write something in Social Europe, which has then been taken up by other people, by TASC. So the TASC post that is quoted in your very excellent report is based on that as well. And then I ended up being invited to a panel in Brussels in the European Parliament next to the Commissioner of Social Rights to discuss the defense of this case. And so what I will do now is just maybe go into the legal but also the political context of this case. How can we understand why did the European Union adopt this? Because if you would have asked anybody 20 years ago, will there be a European Minimum Wage Directive? Nobody would think that something like that would happen. But also, why is it challenged? And I gave the title The Competence Trap, because it's a very creative engagement with competences, which is at the heart of this debate. But it's not a legal debate, it's actually a political debate. So when we look at Emiliano's reasoning, and by the way, he's not just a normal legal expert. Actually, he is the former member of the council in representing, as a permanent representative, the Cypriot government in the council, and in the council he voted for the directive that he wants now to legally abolish. He has also some understanding of Troika politics, because he was also a senior civil servant during the Troika years in Cyprus, so he should know better. Anyhow, but what I found most intriguing, first thing is, what's the reason behind this clause that Oisín just mentioned? I call it the bargaining autonomy clause. So we call it pay exclusion clause, but it's a bargaining autonomy clause, or in German we would say Tarifautonomie clause. The Tarifautonomie is a constitutional principle that was introduced in Germany after the Second World War to protect wages and working conditions from arbitrary governance interventions that you have seen at the very end of the Weimar Republic. So kind of Fempi type interventions. So against that, Tarifautonomie was meant to protect the bargaining autonomy of collective parties in this. So, but then when you read the reasoning, Emiliano argues, I don't know why this clause is there. I've not been able to find any statement of why to protect the contractual autonomy of social partners. But then he immense the reason. In fact, it's certainly the case that by preventing the harmonization of wage levels applicable to each member state, the pay exclusion contributes to maintaining competition between undertakings operating in the internal market. So it turns the explanation of this pay autonomy, tariff autonomy clause in an obligation of competition. So we don't have harmonization of these standards, we must have competition between wage laws. But the funny thing is, this whole social chapter was actually meant to counter competition, to harmonize. That explains why the Tory government of the time opted out of the social title. You know, if the reasoning of Emiliano is correct, the Conservative government would certainly have supported this, but it did not, because it was meant in the Delors years to counterbalance the market, because unions would not, or Social Democrats would not say yes to the common market without some social balance accompanying it. The risk now is that this will lead, if Emiliano wins, it will lead to a so-called Laval type ruling. Laval is a court case in 2007 that argued, yes, we have, of course, free movement of capital, free movement of service, we have social rights, but on balance, the capital rights are more important than the social rights. And that was a case where the court ruled that a Latvian company, Laval, is entitled to ignore collective bargaining in Sweden, and the Swedish unions were wrong to strike to enforce social standards to them. And Laval went to court and won, because the court said, yes, between the rights, between equal rights, the court decides, or force decides. And in that sense, the asocial interpretation won. Why is that important? Because when we went to, as part of our research, to talk to Swedish employers and Business Europe in 2019 in Brussels, they were so self-confident. This has no chance. So this minimum wage directive will be defeated easily by us. So they were really so self-confident that they didn't even mount any action plan, any debate. So they didn't prepare in the political debate any contribution about 60%, 40%, whatever. They didn't have any, they only had one line, and that's the legal line. This European Union cannot do this. It is to be stopped. And they were very self-confident, and the Swedish employer representative we met in Business Europe was boasting to their European colleagues, look, I told you social partnership is great, because we got the Swedish unions from LO to support us on this, and we also got the LO unions from Denmark, and we jointly lobbied the Danish and Swedish government to oppose this in the name of bargaining autonomy. And Swedish unions now, I think I've had some informal discussion with some of them, actually regret it, because they didn't foresee the consequences of all this. But what is also interesting is that the Laval case could be a consequence, and the Laval case in Ireland is always discussed as a conflict between these Eastern Europeans and our Western standards. Or in Sweden itself, that's why the Swedish unions were tricked to support the legal case. It's also debated like that, but who financed the Laval court case? Who wrote the arguments of the Laval court case? The Swedish Employers Association, and that's documented. So the Laval small Baltic company would not have been able to do this. So it was done by the Swedish employers to undermine social rights in Sweden. But then, surprisingly, in the democratic process, Business Europe failed. And I've been interviewing later with leading business HR directors of big American multinationals. So they get phone calls. How the heck can you let this legislation pass with 80% collective bargaining coverage? And I thought we have a conservative majority. And indeed, the conservative Christian Democrats, the liberals, everybody, apart from some far-right and very neoliberal people, supported this. And actually, the 80% bargaining coverage was not proposed by the European Congress of Trade Unions. It was proposed by the conservative European People's Party Christian Democrats that actually outflanked in the European Parliament the ETUC by saying, the ETUC only wants 70%, or the Commission wants 70%. No, I think we should have 80%, okay. So this went through, and employers were completely puzzled, and people had to respond to American multinationals, why did you let it pass? Why didn't it work? And it didn't work because Business Europe undermined its own argument by their own action. By the way, with support of the American Chamber of Commerce, because both the American Chamber of Commerce and Business Europe called after the financial crisis in a radical policy shift in terms of European wage policy. Why? Because they thought that creating a common market would lead to convergence in wages, of course downward convergence, but it would lead to a harmonization of wages automatically by the market. But it led, the really existing common market, as we know in the financial crisis, would lead to macroeconomic imbalances that were about to explode the whole European Union and the financial monetary union in particular. And in this context, it was Business Europe that triggered a silent resolution in EU governance by convincing first Barroso to shift this orientation and to make wages a European competence de facto by establishing this new economic governance regime that, as Oisín has said, allowed European executives to prescribe prescriptions that are very detailed, including wage cuts and others. And in the book, we have documented that. And of course, you just read the first line over there. We remember, already mentioned, we know in Ireland exactly what has happened. So it was a European, adopted by the Council of Finance Ministers, including the Danish and Swedish one. The prescription, reduce your national minimum wage by €1. And then, but we also see it goes down even to Germany. Even Germany got some prescriptions that were linking, maybe your national minimum wage. Not about adequacy, but it's maybe too high compared to creation of employment. So you have this neoliberal argumentation. So we documented that. And that's why I was so outraged reading Emiliano when he said, the European Adequate Minimum Wage Directive is the first legal instrument at EU level in the field of minimum wages. It's just false. It's just a lie. And that is why colleagues from Florence, the labour lawyer, the Irish labour lawyer Claire Patrick, and her German colleague Mark Steyer said, that's why this case is so intriguing, because it's based on legal, so factually false arguments. But then what could people say in response? And what could the courts, so you would say legally, you have a strong feeling, but what could the court say to make it possible, nevertheless? The argument is, of course, that the new economic governance regime, where now we have now a kind of a regime that works like your annual meeting with your HR director in your job, where you have to, in the so-called European semester process, every country has to listen what goals are set for itself, and then work to implement them in the next year, these 5-4 prescriptions. And then, if not, if these prescriptions are not implemented, there are sanctions, but they are not legal sanctions. So this is a system that is written in legislation. We have the 6 PACS laws on European economic governance that specify how this kind of HRM type of governance that mimics actually the governance of multinational cooperation vis-à-vis subsidiary, which also work with key performance indicators and prescriptions, how this is actually done. And we know there are different levels of coercive power. If you are in a memorandum of understanding, as we were in Ireland, the coercive power is very significant, because if you don't do what you're told, there is the withdrawal of financial assistance every 3 months. So it's an immediate sanction. But then it would be wrong to think that we are out of the bailout, that we don't have these constraints anymore. We still have them, because the six-pack on economic governance now says that if you are in an excessive debt position according to the Stability and Growth Pact, or if you are having excessive macroeconomic imbalances, and that is defined as everything that risks, not does, but risk kind of affecting, undermining the proper functioning of the European economy, member states can be fined. 0.1% of GDP for MEP violations, 0.2 MEP for Stability and Growth Pact violation. But more importantly, it's not this kind of nuclear power approach, nuclear bomb approach. It's a new thing that came in later in 2014, the withdrawal of EU funding. So structural funding won't be paid if you don't do what we tell you to do. And then, of course, we have had this kind of prescriptions already under the open method of coordination before, but they were weak. But they were important because it allowed the European executives to build up the bureaucracy and the apparatus to start kind of monitoring member states. So in my way, so people could argue that this is not law, and therefore the European Union is allowed to do it, and actually the court in many cases, in the Pringle case and on the other cases later on, has decided that the economic governance regime is legal. And it's based not on the article on the competence on working conditions, but it's based on the articles of the treaties that allow the European Union procedures of macroeconomic surveillance. Okay, already voted. It was already there in the Maastricht Treaty, but we didn't realize, and it was only activated after 2008 to create this. And in my view, the argument is these prescriptions are actually more challenging that's why it's a competence trap, because the minimum wage directive was actually supported very strongly by Esther Lynch and others, because Esther realized that this pay exclusion didn't protect us in terms of these wage cuts, so we need to have a European instrument in European law that can protect us in the next crisis from these kind of vertical interventions. And the problem was, unfortunately, that Sweden and our Swedish and Danish unions were outside of the euro. They didn't experience this argument of troika interventions, whereas our Finnish colleagues did. So they have the same Nordic system, but the Finnish colleagues supported this directive precisely because they knew that this is actually about protecting wages from unilateral interventions. So, as Oisín has said, the main argument is how can you say, Emiliano, that the EU lacks the authority to adopt the decommodifying minimum wage directive, so a directive that takes out wages from market pressures, then after a decade of commodifying interventions in the area. And we did that really intensively in Ireland, Romania, Italy and Germany in our book, but colleagues also looked at it counter by counter, prescription for the whole European Union, and we can document that. So that's why it's shocking to see that an Advocate General can say something that EU has nothing to do with wages when after these 15 years of interventions. So the problem is really a political one, and maybe that explains why the court ruling, which has been announced for the 6th of May has been postponed. So it's not there on the calendar. I just checked before. It has been pushed back. Because it will be an important ruling. It will be an important ruling because on the one side we have this strong business pressures. So it's not just Emiliano, it's Denmark behind, it's Business Europe and the American Chamber of Commerce and big business interests pressing very hard to get this error. Why did the European Christian Democrats sleep in the European Parliament? Why did you let this socialist Christian Democrat take over the minimum wage issue as a rapporteur? How did you let get through? Did you pay attention to correct this error, so to speak? So there is huge, strong business pressure, but on the other side, there is maybe hope, because I don't know how, if the directive is abolished, labor Euroscepticism, which is a strong driver of Euroscepticism, will increase. How will workers will not understand why business-friendly or governance prescription of wage cuts are legal, why on the other side labor-friendly directive, which very softly, you know, it's not prescribing wage levels, you know, it's just a framework. How this is not. So it is an important issue for Europe, and I just think of the next EU treaty referendum. You know, if this goes down, how we will next how the pro-European social forces will win a next EU treaty referendum when you have this, if you had an Emmanuel type ruling again in this case. But then, maybe a last word about, to finish with a funny note, what happens if it goes through? Then you can actually turn the tables on Leo Varadkar, because you presented, and you are of course right, that Ireland did adopt the living wage policy as a direct consequence of the minimum wage directive. But Leo, when he announced the living wage framework of the 60%, did not mention the European Minimum Wage Directive with one word. He did a press conference 3 days before it was adopted in Brussels. And he did that because he knew it will be adopted anyway. So he thought, I'm clever. Now I can announce a social measure which will come anyway, which we can't stop. And we do the press conference on the living wage 3 days before the directive is adopted, and therefore can present it as a genuine Leo Varadkar inner idea. So if, I don't hope, but if that is happening and the worst case scenario is happening, we can just remind Leo, look, you said yourself when you had the press conference, it had nothing to do with you being a directive, that was your social conscience that brought you to propose this European, this Irish living wage policy that you have just announced at that time. Okay, thanks very much.
You've been spoken at and to quite a bit, so I'll kind of keep this brief. And I just want to say, I think the work that Oisín has done has been incredible. When we met to look at the first draft, he had nailed it pretty much, and it was just about tweaking it, but it's excellent work. We're delighted that ICTU and FSU were very supportive too. A couple of things I would say, just we have prioritised this issue for the last number of years at the expense of everything else. And it remains to be seen whether we'll be vindicated on that. I think it was the right thing to do. We saw this as a huge opportunity that needed to be exploited. We've tried to popularise it within the movement, outside of the movement, and see it for what it is. I don't think the full transposition of the directive gives us mandatory trade union recognition. I want to say that. I don't think it was ever going to do that. But I do think there is a trend and a context, and we're on a road that I think that there is a logical destination. And the context of that is obviously at the Leaf High Level report, but in the in Oisín's piece, I think it's page 37, he quotes Judge Hogan on the H.A. O'Neill judgment, where Judge Hogan talks about the zone of freedom to organise and campaign for unions that is not yet fully defined. It's as if you can touch it, but you can't see it. I think it's also important to remember a really important piece of academic research done by Roland's colleagues in UCD, John Geary, Union Voice in Ireland, 2021. They're doing another one, Union Voice in Ireland 2025-2026. It's going to be all of the island of Ireland, which I think is important. And the two stats that jump out, 44% of workers not in a union want one. 67% of 16 to 24-year-olds not in a union want one. And I think that's crucial. So whether this directive is annulled, and I hope it isn't, and the sense I get from talking to people is that it won't be, but you never know. But if it were to be annulled, the demand still needs to be met. And, you know, we're not going to give up. We might just change our strategy. And it's quite interesting to see that the UK obviously is outside the European Union. Northern Ireland, devolved state, very limited powers. But yesterday, the Minister for the Economy there, Caoimhe Archibald, in the Assembly at 4 p.m. gave a speech, and in it she talked about the Good Jobs Bill. And one of the things they're going to do in Northern Ireland, which has better rights when it comes to collective bargaining as we currently stand, they're going to legislate for access to the workplace, both physical and digital. The Starmer government in Britain, which is not exactly the most inspirational Labour government, but one of the things they are doing with the TUC is passing a bill, a similar Good Jobs agenda that will be legislated for by the summer of 2026. And in it, they're going to do two fundamental things: give legal rights to access physical and digital to the workplace, and they're also going to punish companies by a percentage of turnover when it comes to union busting. The UK, Northern Ireland, Britain, already at a place much better than the rest of us. Very interested to hear Roland's contribution, particularly about Business Europe. IBEC have certainly taken their playbook. IBEC's position on this issue has been nothing to say, nothing to do. And then when the government said we're going to have a public consultation on the action plan, they panicked. And they're not happy with that. IBEC's attitude to all of this has been, all of this stuff is fluffy and a luxury and it's grand and things are good. But when the proverbial hits the fan, we've no time and no bandwidth for it, which is very much in line with Business Europe. And it's interesting what Roland said about the Swedes and the Danes, and I mean, it's a disgraceful decision, in particularly of the Danish trade union movement, to work with their government.
Only one federation of Sweden.
Yeah, but FH, but they're a very powerful one, and still to this day, they come to the ETUC and they defend this, and it's outrageous, frankly. Notwithstanding the fact that the ETUC did everything it could to bend over backwards to facilitate Swedish and Danish needs. But frankly, their needs and their concerns are irrational. It's similar to the German attitude to inflation, maybe. You know, it's in the psyche. It's not rational, and it's a problem. As a participant in the discussions here with Greg Ennis and a couple of other colleagues on the action plan, I mean, our view is the Irish government has not transposed the Adequate Minimum Wages Directive. The 15th of November came and went, and the Minister signed a statutory instrument tricking around with the Low Pay Commission, effectively negligible stuff. The real proof of the pudding will be in the action plan, and our attitude towards the government's position on this will be determined exclusively by what comes out of that action plan. And there is a public consultation at the moment, and I hope many people and the public servants we're dealing with will be delighted for me to say I hope many people and many individuals put in lots of submissions, because it's very important. You can be sure the employers will. It's crucial that we do. But if you were to say what needs to be in that action plan as a kind of a minimum, and there's many things, but I would have thought there's three fundamental issues, because we've seen no public policy change, we've seen no legislative change that in any way promotes collective bargaining since the directive was put out there in October 2022. Three things I think we'd need to see. One, we'd need to see legislative rights for our workplace representatives. Our health and safety reps have legal rights. Our workplace representatives, our shop stewards have none. And we're out of line with the rest of Europe when it comes to that. We're out of line with Northern Ireland as it currently stands when it comes to that. The second thing I think we would fundamentally need to see, if we're going to have access to the workplace in Europe, we have to have it in Dundalk. We cannot have a situation where we have members in our Congress and unions in our Congress that have the right to access the workplace in Derry, but not in Donegal. That is an issue that is going to have to be addressed. And the GDPR issue is the same in Northern Ireland and Britain, because they haven't amended or appealed those legislative issues yet. And we have to get around that, but that is a fundamental. And the third thing that has to happen, and it's more of a kind of a cultural change and a policy change, we need to see the state as an advocate and an enabler for collective bargaining, rather than a kind of a disinterested bystander. And I think the state at best has been a disinterested bystander, and at worst has been an inhibitor. So there are three fundamental things I think we need to see. I was at I'll finish on this. I was at a communications workers union seminar yesterday, and we were talking about collective bargaining, and it was timely because 131 years ago to the day yesterday was the first conference and Congress of the Irish Trade Union Confederation, the forerunner, the organisation that came before the ICTU in the 28th of April 1894. And they had 36 motions. The Irish Labour Historical Society, who are the custodians of our history, I think some people here from the Irish Labour Historical Society, a wonderful society, they have digitised the proceedings of that first event. And there was a motion that jumped out when I looked at it, 131 years on. And forgive the male domination in the language, because there's only 2 women delegates at the conference, and of course it was all about men in 1894. But it was a motion for tramway workers, motion 34. It's short, that's another thing that we could learn from our history. Our motions these days are ridiculously long, their speeches. This is very short, so indulge me in reading it out. There's 2 parts to it. The second part is the bit undone. It says that this Congress supports the demand that the Dublin District Tramway Men's Union for a 9-hour working day, Sundays included. Well, that's been achieved, but the next part is the relevant bit. Quote, and considers that the demand of the men to be received by the company as a body and not as individuals in matters in dispute between the company and themselves is just, reasonable, and should be acceded to. Now, what are we looking for today? We're looking for the private sector veto that employers in this state have, relatively unique to our peers in the European Union, to be done away with ultimately. Do I think the directive is going to do that in itself? No, but I think it's going to chip away significantly at it. And if you think about it, we would say the directive has the potential to be transformative and radical, but its outworkings are entirely modest. It is that workers who want to organise and want to access collective bargaining can do so, like they can in most other jurisdictions across the European Union. And we are seeing a kind of a trend and a tradition now in the last number of weeks and months of the current government saying it's workers' rights stuff, it's gone too far. I found it fascinating. Where has it gone far? What, bereavement leave? An extra day's public holiday? Is that radical revolutionary stuff? It hasn't gone far enough. But the concern, and I think the government underestimate this, the reason why some of the progress we're seeing in Northern Ireland and Britain, it's no surprise that it's after 2 years of persistent and consistent industrial action, strike action. And maybe there's a message for us here in this jurisdiction. But I do believe if the government are going to continue to roll back on the living wage, the sick pay, and these issues, it will lead to that. Because as they have said, and I bet constantly say, when the minimum wage goes up, it's the wages of those above that. The wages of those above that are collectively bargained by many unions in this room. If employers are going to take the signal of the living wage being delayed as an opportunity to suppress wages in the private sector that is collectively bargained and organised, and in the public sector, and we have a pay deal coming to an end next year, well, that will send a message, I think, to the trade union movement that will be resisted. So the government are at a fork in the road, and they have a decision to take as to which way they go. The action plan can either be agreed or not. It's not going to be agreed. IBEC aren't going to agree to even the most modest measures that we would require. So the government are going to have to call it. But if what we're seeing is the trajectory that they are on, there has to be a comprehensive response from the labour movement in the Republic of Ireland. For there not to be, quite frankly, would be shameful and would be a dereliction of duty on behalf of the over 500,000 workers we organise, but more importantly, it would be a dereliction of duty to the 44% of workers not in a union who are locked out of the union movement because of the private sector employer veto. So if it's good enough for Ryanair, who realised that it actually is in their business interest because there's a pilot shortage and because Forsa, previously Impact, and many other European unions turned the screws on them, if it's good enough for them, it surely is good enough for the Irish government to say, we will modify our legislative environment so that workers, citizens, constituents, men and women, our young people, if they want to organise themselves in a union, that they will have the right to do it. There's nothing radical or revolutionary about that. It's actually quite modest. It's actually quite normal. It's about modernising our industrial relations. It's about dragging it into the 21st century. And I think there's a real test for this government. And I think they are in a false sense of security if they feel this is not an issue. I think what they have done with the living wage, look at the stuff in the papers over the weekend, look at the feedback as to how people feel. I think the things that we in this room and the opposition are saying is resonating. And I think if they drop the ball on the adequate minimum wages directive, or if they drop the ball on the demand for something should the adequate minimum wages directive be annulled, when all around us, Northern Ireland, Britain and the rest of Europe, and by the way, people will say there's progress in minimum wages in Europe on the directive, but less on collective bargaining. Less on collective bargaining because they have it. They are way, way ahead. So the heavy lifting has to be done here in Ireland when it comes to collective bargaining. And I think we're at a real inflection point over the next 12 months. And we have to make sure that if the government drop the ball, that we are fit and ready to challenge that in whatever way. And I think we need to learn the lessons of what we've seen in Northern Ireland and Britain should they do that. Thanks very much.
To ICTU and to the Financial Services Union for basically funding this discussion. TASC may have hosted it and put her name on it, have the banners behind me and so on, but without that assistance it wouldn't be possible. And in that context I obviously want to reiterate our gratitude to Owen Reidy, not just for that event but for the constant support we get. Also I think I should mention Gerald Gibbons, the Social and Policy and Legislative Officer, for his work. John O'Connell, obviously the General Secretary of the Financial Services Union, I want to thank him. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank our own Shane O'Cohen, the Chief Executive, the Executive Director, I should say, of TASC for her input into the preparations. And then Michelle O'Sullivan from the University of Limerick, who's also lecturer in the University of Limerick, but she's also on the board of TASC. And Professor Claire Fitzpatrick from the European University Institute. But most especially, I think you'll agree with me with regard to today and why today was, I believe, such a success, is yourself, Oisín. Thank you very much. Your document is excellent. Your explication of it and analysis and elaboration on it was even more so. It was a very, very productive discussion. And can I just say, TASC, as I say, we regard ourselves very, very closely aligned with the trade union movement. Our values in TASC are very close to those of the best values of the trade union movement. I'm personally a trade union official, or I was a trade union official all my working life. I never had a real job. Just to say that regardless of what happens, the trade union movement was here not just before MLU. The trade union movement was here before the EU or the EEC ever existed. The trade union movement will be here long after either of them may go into decline or whatever. At the end of the day, the laws are wonderful. The legal underpinning is wonderful. But the main strength of the trade union member is gatherings such as this, in halls, in drafty rooms, right around the country, branch committee meetings, where ordinary, extraordinary workers come together and decide that we have much greater chance of influencing a society to be the kind of society that we would all be proud of if we behave collectively. It's what marks us out from so many other organisations. We prioritise and we see the strength of collective action. Today, under the banner of TASC, you come together. I think there was a sharing, I had sensed a sharing of idealism. It was a wonderful educational event. As chairman of TASC, I'm particularly proud to have been given the privilege of chairing such a worthwhile debate. And thank you very much for your attention. Sorry you ran over time, but then again, it's a trade union movement. I wouldn't be